Let's reflect further on Odinga's legacy with writer and Africa commentator Joseph Ochieno. So Ochieno, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for your time. Raila Odinga was a patriotic and selfless leader, according to President Cyril Ramaphosa.
President Ramaphosa is absolutely right. Not only was he patriotic, but he was one of those, if you asked me to give 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 obvious names of big African men, particularly men of their age group, you would include Raila Odinga. This is one of those, lest we forget, amongst the progressive left young Africans of those years who not only studied in the East, not that it matters, but completely committed to not only Pan-Africanism, but total African liberation of the continent, and also lived Pan-Africanism in terms of values. Raila, I was lucky to have met him. He now attained this name, Baba. I suddenly realized that earlier this morning, as I was conveying a small message to somebody related, I was finding it difficult to use the word Raila, meaning you have to strike Baba there, because he attained this. This is one of the biggest names, one of the biggest faces, one of the most influential African figures who, unfortunately, just about missed to become a president. One of the most extraordinary things about him was also that privileged that I spoke to one of his close aides, sometimes early part of this year, who told me, that, she was struggling with resentment, trying to come to terms with the grievances of alleged election rigging in the last elections. And she told me, a relatively young person, that Raila put her down like his daughter, who actually quite qualifies, talked her through. And she said she left Raila Odinga a different person. I think this is such an extraordinary character that's going to take us a long, long time to come to terms with the reality of his. I was lucky to have met him a few times, but this is a guy who at 80 does not look 80. Of course, is slightly physically big for that, but permanently exhausted because he's permanently busy, but permanently alert at all times. This is an extraordinary figure. I think not only has Kenya and Luoland lost, I think East Africa has lost. This continent has lost one of really, really the true great African statesmen who never stepped onto State House.
Well, some people say he missed out on being a president because his campaigns were populist.
This is somebody who was first arrested, tortured, and confined in solitary spaces way back in 1982 when he was about 37. Granted, that's relatively old if you can look at it from this perspective. But this is somebody who struggled far more than he lived, and struggled with the push for democracy, push for multipartyism, push for human rights, both in Kenya and across this continent. But not only that, I think the things that Raila Odinga talked about are the real things of African needs. In fact, I've got a close friend of mine elsewhere, out of the continent, who actually shed tears when Raila was declared not a leader. Part of what people like myself, who are not only observers and writers and followers and people who relate with some of these personalities, but people who strongly believe that this world needs a progressive left political direction, and particularly this continent. You would say that the things that Raila talked about, and that's one of the reasons why he was extremely popular, particularly including in the broad Nairobi, quite unusual, and across the Republic of Kenya. Why? Because he spoke people's languages. This guy talked about the basics that progressive left politicians and leaders should talk about: basic health, basic education. It talked infrastructure, by the way, in a very big way. It talked housing. The infrastructure progress in Kenya in the last 10, 15 years directly linked to some of his own initiatives. And so, no, by the way, this is the son of a first vice president of Kenya. Absolutely rich, progressively privileged, very, very business-orientated, but extremely ordinary, modest person. So Raila was a ordinary people's person. He knew and lived with people. In fact, I can tell you that early this year at Siaya, where Governor Orengo of Siaya hosted a lower nation communities that include, ironically, what would otherwise be his nemesis, President Ruto and President Museveni of Uganda. I was lucky to be there. You move around some of these places and you find extremely ordinary people. They own Raila Odinga. Why? Because they feel Raila feels them. Raila knows them. And Raila plus his other older brother, Oburu Odinga, ironically. These are guys who've been brought up in a rather unique way. And I think maybe guys like yourselves should actually carry out special investigative programs to test and learn and write how people like Raila Odinga come out of this privilege, but then link and connect with ordinary African peoples, and they push. In other words, they lived, the lives that they met and found, but also lived with ordinary people. So it's about that. And finally, if I may say so, the cost of living campaigns that he led, where people thought that he was pushing it because he wanted to push out President Ruto. Turns out the youth, the Gen Zs of Kenya, so-called, came and picked up this thing. One of his biggest rallies, again, was in Western Kenya, in Bungoma, town of Bungoma. Again, I found myself coincidentally in Kenya, and I went and attended it. Now, if you consider the language that this man was talking about, it was the language of ordinary Africans. I think if Raila came to Soweto, he would be wrapped up by the average South African in terms of what he stood for. So no, I wouldn't suggest that he was populist. He was basically being a realist. But as I said, unfortunately, it would have been very interesting to see if he ever became president, what he would have done to translate those values and convictions into practice.
Well, some people have said that because in 2007 he led a protest that plunged the country into its most serious trouble since the 60s, resulting in more than 1,000 people dying, and some hold him responsible for that as something that should never have happened, no matter what his beliefs were.
That's an extraordinary observation. It's long since I last heard that. I was a columnist with the New African magazine at the time, and I was based in London. And I did, particularly for major global networks, a huge amount of reporting on the post-election violence in Kenya, as it happens. But I can tell you that whatever was happening in Kenya was not driven by a person who effectively lost the elections. If grievances come out, if the fight against apartheid comes out, you don't go ahead and blame the guys who simply say, no, take a position. Raila was more of the victim, and he's coming to a predominant of the victim. Interestingly, to authoritatively confirm this, once the investigations came in and once the investigations came up, his name was never forwarded to The Hague. Ironically, Ruto and Kenyatta and others were found slightly much more wanting than Raila Odinga. Raila was much more of a victim. And that's why I'm saying again, that if you consider the number of times this man has been a presidential candidate, the number of times he lost, the modesty and response with which he came up. Raila was possibly more likely to restrain his supporters than to push them in a direction of violence. But as I said, post-election violence, wherever it is, or perhaps violence and riots, whether it happens in Nepal or whichever other African countries that I don't want to name at the moment, when these things happen, I think it's difficult to suggest that the lead people who are perhaps lead victims, lead voices, take responsibility. But of course, they take responsibility from a perspective of whether or not they push people towards that, or they're able to order restraint. I think Raila is the restrained man. As I told you at the beginning, that he was able to tell people close to him to hold back on people like Ruto, to hold back on Uhuru Kenyatta, and to hold back on Mwai Kibaki. And for these guys, for him to die relatively friends with these people, where some ordinary people sometimes even fail to understand him. Obviously, your question is fair, but I think I would defend him rather robustly.
Joseph Ochieno, let me thank you very much for your time, writer and Africa commentator on the death of Raila Odinga of Kenya.